Welcome to Book Talk, and I'm your host, Anthony Moirore. At Book Talk, we get to have an author come and tell us about his book or her book. And today, great day, where we are going to hear of a book known as Caged. It's an interesting book, but we'll get to hear everything from the author herself because she's with us. So without taking one more minute, I'm going to introduce to the show Lara Sabanosh, and I hope I got that right.
You did, yes, Lara.
Okay, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, and we are honored that you took your time to come and share with us something to do with your book, Caged. And yeah, here we are. But before we go into the book, we'd like to know you. Who are you? Where are you from? Maybe where you grew up, or something like that.
Sure. Well, a little bit about me before the book. I grew up in um, pretty, actually, it's pretty boring, but I guess, but I grew up in various parts of the country. Um, my parents, my mom and dad, and I have a brother. But I'm East and West Coast, a little bit down in the South. And so I got to see a lot of different things as I was growing up, met a lot of different people. And my parents were very much into, you know, um, my brother and I learning. Not just being educated, but um, life experiences as we moved around the country, getting involved in community and um, different parts of wherever we were. And then eventually I went off to school. And I was always involved in some type of helping um, field, even before I went off to school and working with somebody, whether through volunteering or jobs, and eventually getting into the psychology fields and education as well, and teaching throughout the
Mm-hmm.
years. And I was, even throughout my career, whether it was working with service members, um, community efforts, military, it's just been a part of who I am even before. I'm now retired. I have two beautiful daughters who have gone on themselves. I have one that's graduating, which I'm so proud. And I have my older daughter who has graduated herself with 2 degrees, and have gone on to be very independent, beautiful young women. So for now, I am retired with working. I have two rescue animals, and that is a big thing for me now as well. And so at these days, what I have, the book that has come out is a memoir, because with that, I'm also a survivor of domestic violence. And
Mm.
I have gone into outreach, talking about what life is like for many of us that have lived through those experiences, and a part of that life as well. Because while I didn't grow up living a life of abuse, I spent my adult life living that as well.
Mm. And when you talk of the country, you're talking about the United States of America. That's
Yes. So
yeah,
as we talked, I know that you are over in Greece,
yeah.
but I'm here in the United States. So I grew up. When I was growing up, lived. I've lived in California, New York, Pennsylvania, down in Florida, and different parts. Um, when I um, and then once I was married, I also lived a little bit overseas. Never and But mostly in the United States.
Mm.
So for those that are understanding my story. While it's a universal story, it was my story is with me in the United States.
Oh, okay. So your book is Caged, Caged, and the true story of
Correct.
abuse, betrayal, and
Um,
GTMO. And GTMO, at first I was confused what is GTMO, and I guess someone looking at it or hearing it for the first time would be confused as well. Can you tell us what is
sure.
GTMO?
It's the acronym for GTMO.
Mhm,
And most people would recognize GTMO. It's the naval station in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, which is where the last, for those that would be military buffs or would understand as a duty station for government employees and military who um, are stationed down in Cuba. It's a closed military installation, and my husband and I were down there as civilian. I was there with him. He was a civilian employee. And ultimately, I was an employee down there as well with a government position.
mm,
So as the my husband and I met almost 20 years prior to that, when I was home. I was 19 um, when we met, and I was home from college.
mhm.
And the Gitmo was the last place that had lived before he had died.
Oh, okay. Now, Caged, why did you choose the title?
Um, Caged was a reference to, and I think that many survivors would feel this way, and victims of domestic violence. It's a culmination of what you feel over time when you are, in some respects, trapped in relationships, and you don't feel like there's any place else to go.
Mm-hmm,
Um, whether it's it's not that people may not know what's happening or you don't know what's happening, um, but there's no way out.
mm-hmm,
And it's the idea of, over time, even if you felt you can get outside of the cage becomes part of who you are, and still is, even after all these years. It's been over 7 years. For me, that cage still becomes a part of who I am. And while I lived through many years of domestic violence, the cage is sometimes becomes a safe haven too afterwards, because it's what you become, what you know in life.
mm-hmm,
And so it's the process when I was writing the book, for people to understand, which was a question I got asked often. Why don't you leave? Why did you stay so long? Because it is part of our life, and we don't necessarily know any different or think we can go any better, go anywhere else, because of how we feel in these relationships. And even after years of getting out of them, there is a lot to work through, from domestic violence, of understanding whether or not we can get into healthy relationships afterwards and
mm-hmm.
not revert back to that cage, that we lived in for so long.
Yes, and as you say, I want to believe that it's not only you who's been through that. We have
No,
many, many people who go through it, and they don't have an idea of how to get out of it. And
no,
so they continue to live and maybe even give up on life on every area of their lives because they are pressed somewhere that they don't have the strength to push out of.
no, absolutely. And, I had, there was a period of time where, you you have to convey to people that as time goes on, the person that you enter into the relationship with, explaining to people, I didn't grow up this way.
Mm-hmm.
And so as I enter, and nobody comes to you into the relationship and is and and enters into it and tells you, I'm an abuser. Can
Mm-hmm.
I abuse you?
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea that you enter into these relationships, well, they are a wonderful person.
Mm-hmm.
And but as time goes on and they start becoming the person they are, then you start losing who you were before you entered the relationship. And
Mm-hmm.
as I would explain to people, I began to die a little bit each time the abuse started taking over,
Mm-hmm.
which is where the cage would envelop me as things would go on. And so who I was, it wasn't that I ever lost who I was, but it would go so deep inside. It just felt like I was dying each time another abuse, another word, another piece of me lost the control that I always felt I had. And so it is depressing. It is, you don't feel strong. You feel like a weak person.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of shame. And so you begin going through life with a lot of, um, blanket emotion, just to keep face, because you don't want people to know the life you're really living.
Mm. And it's something good that you've done to come up with a book and tell us what goes on there. And I believe at the end of it, tell us how to come out of it there, of it, because it's very good. And this is something that I always say. If you've been to some place, some challenging position, and you've come out of it, it's always good to give it out there, give the story out there so that someone else could be helped by the words that you share and find his way or her way out of the situation. So thank you very much for writing this book. What are
Thank you
the
so much. And I
yeah.
agree.
So what are some of the experiences that you've shared in the book that you'd also like to share with us on this program? I mean, the app needs to
Sure.
be, yeah.
Well, for myself, the idea that there is this notion that when you become part of systems, or people have, this idea that there are greater entities out there that are, if you just say something, that
Mm-hmm.
somebody will be there to help you. And that is, where the universal, idea of the book comes out. So even though my story is, within the United States, it really becomes a universal piece, regardless of the country you live in,
Mm-hmm.
because there is a breakdown among all, areas for domestic violence. It becomes a dirty secret, regardless of where you're at, and especially here in the United States, and within the military system here in the United States. But the idea that if people would just say, I'm in a relationship that has domestic violence, I'm being abused, that somebody will swoop in and save them, and which is where questions come back in to victims, and survivors, and when they're asked, well, why did you stay so long? Well, who is there to help me? And when I was being questioned, I got asked those questions by, agencies, and I'm like, well, where were you
Mm-hmm.
when I have had protective orders over the years, and, there were counselors that were there and witnessed things, but that didn't stop anything. And
Mm-hmm.
then forward many years later, so this breakdown of assistance, that and myth that there are appropriate, laws or, um, agencies that will come in and they will help victims and survivors, is not there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's still, it's like a seesaw.
Mm-hmm.
And I often say that the higher up it's a show and a fanfare that they do about domestic violence, because it's down here where people really need the resources, that it's not being implemented correctly.
Mm-hmm.
There, here in the United States, we have a funding problem for for shelters, for people to get safe assistance, for military dependents, to make sure that when they report domestic violence, that it's actually being taken seriously and action is being done correctly. And even in my case, when I'm saying I have a problem, that was actually not done. As a matter of fact, when the media came out regarding my story, there was actually nothing mentioned about domestic violence.
Mm-hmm.
And there is, and nor has there ever been. And the idea is that it's far easier to put the blame on a victim or a survivor for the situation that caused the angry outburst, and it still does.
Mm-hmm.
It still creates, I hear far too often, and I've had people who've outreached because of the book, where court systems, regardless of the country, where they said, well, what did you do to make them so angry?
Mm-hmm.
There is nothing anybody can do that could make an individual so angry that they hit you,
Mm-hmm.
that they that they create financial control, religious control, that emotional and psychological damage. There
Mm-hmm.
is nothing an individual can do that is a green light for abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing.
Yeah.
And so, whether you don't like what your spouse does or your partner does, is not an okay response to abuse them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And unfortunately, we are still at a point in 2022 where there is a great amount of individuals who still look at the fact that, well, if this person, if my spouse or partner behaves in a certain way, then I'm entitled to react in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
until that changes,
Mm-hmm.
then we're still going to have abuse,
Yeah.
and that's the problem.
Yeah, and it's good that you talked about the different kinds of abuse, because I was just imagining, and you mentioned of 2022, the year that we are at, and I've come to meet children. Now, this I'm talking about children, not even people who are big enough to be in relationships, but children who are under their parents. And the story now is far much different from when I was growing up and where I grew up, because once a child did a wrong back then,
Mhm.
maybe now even in some other parts of the world, then the child was going to meet with some serious beating.
Right.
Today you wouldn't hear of such a case where a child is beaten, or I mean, even a lock in the room is punishment enough that that child can raise a voice to the police, and the police would do something to the parents because the child was locked in a room. I mean,
Sure.
so the different kinds of abuses you mentioned, uh, in
Excuse
your
me.
you've experienced some of them and some of the extremes, and in your job, in your interactions, because you've interacted with a lot of people who've been undergoing some domestic violence, do you still have such extremes even today in 2022 of beatings and all that kind of extremes?
Yeah, yes, there still are. I mean, there are still people who um, feel that your partners, your children are property.
Mm,
And since you brought up children,
mhm,
yeah, yes, that and children would fall under at least in or would be child abuse, but it
mm,
is teaching the next generation of how how we react, how we behave, and so you're creating another cycle of how we react to uh, violence.
mm,
And even when I was counseling with families and trying to work through mindsets, my parents were not I would call it hands-on in that capacity.
mhm,
um, they weren't people who chose to well, if I did what they considered something wrong, that they used spanking or those mechanisms as a way to deal with the situation.
mhm,
um, they were teachable moments.
mm,
And where I would hear somebody who would use the, well, maybe they just need to get a good spanking, or they just need, if they were my kid, I would beat them, and they would understand never to do it again.
yeah.
But honestly, then that does tend to trickle into the same kind of verbiage I heard in my marriage.
Mm,
If you would just listen to me, then I wouldn't have to do the things that I do. If you
mm,
would just listen, then I wouldn't have to say the things. And that's exactly how I felt. I
mm,
felt like a child who was being disciplined. And I don't think that, it is the understanding that what we teach or what our children see. And there are people who don't agree with that, but we are trying to show, as parents, the idea is that we want what's better for our children and coming in the future.
mhm,
um, and I have often said to people who have not agreed with the ideas of domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, and most of the time it's fear or misunderstanding, or not having to have seen it firsthand, and putting it back into somebody and saying, but what if it was your child? What if it was your sister?
mm,
Or what if you found out that it was your mother, or your brother, somebody in your family that you were so closely with, and then they started to tell you that they're in a relationship where somebody was beating them?
mm,
Or that you were watching your nieces and nephews, and then all of a sudden they didn't want you to touch them because what, that hurt because they had just been disciplined.
mm,
And I said it would break your heart, because that's not how you feel that that's what you would do. And so how would you react? And so it is one of those things where you don't feel you would, when it comes close to home, and all of a sudden you would do everything to move mountains for a person in your own house to make sure that they are safe, and you would want everything to be the right way. And growing up that they get better, it's when it comes close to home that that's when people look to change things, because they would never want anyone in their own personal space to be able ever to be hurt like that. And you're right. Now it's not okay to turn around and physically discipline. Oh, but I still hear it that people think that that's what would change the world, if we would just you know, uh, you know, spank kids more than we used to. But
mm,
actually, no, it's a very different
mm,
way. And believe me, I'm sure there are a lot of adults out there that have never been punched in the back of the head. And I can honestly tell you, there's nothing worse than having somebody punch you in the back of the head.
mm,
So if they think that hitting their child is a way to discipline them, then they should wonder what it feels like for themselves if they get punched in the back of the head and get told that if they would just listen, that they will understand.
Hmm. So thank you very much for sharing that. In your book, you tell stories of the experiences that you've been through and come out. I was looking through the table of contents and I see some beautiful or interesting topics there covered in the chapters, like all kinds of abuse. Another chapter goes the tale of two vacations, and another chapter says broken bones, and another one goes a night of assaults. Now, in your topics, in your chapters, is there one that you'd like us to share in depth with us here? One of them.
Um, well,
Mm-hmm.
um, well, I don't know. I didn't even think to pick. I've never had to just pick um,
I
um,
mean, your whole book is a beautiful one. You can just open a page and start and dive us into it. Yeah.
sure.
Mm,
Here, I will just. Um, I could. Let's see. Here we go. I will just start from. Well, I could just. I'll do chapter. Yeah, I could just do chapter 4.
okay. We'll go.
Um, did you want me to read it?
You do us pleasure of reading a few lines.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, all right. So, um, here we go.
Mm-hmm.
I will do from, I'll start on, it's page 25. And
Okay.
actually, this is when my husband actually had, it's from chapter 4, All Kinds of Abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And this was actually when my husband had gone out and, and he had gotten a DUI.
Mm.
Um, and it was um, throughout the year. And so um, he ended up in 2001, just a
Mm-hmm.
little backstory.
Okay.
And then he went out in 2001. My youngest at the time was a year old, and he ended up going out with a friend. He was supposed to stay sober,
Mm-hmm.
and then he was not.
Okay.
Um, At 10:45, the evening before I was heading to bed, Chris was assuring me he was sober. Obviously, he wasn't. A friend had called to warn me about his erratic behavior. He had tried to help Chris, but ended up in a fight with him, and Chris had bitten him. He can't come home. The intensity of my anger surprised me. I had never been so forceful. My hands shook. I'm not dealing with him anymore. My mom was at the house staying with us, and she woke up to hear all of this. I called Chris's brother and told him he should go pick him up, but not to bring him to our house. Take his keys, otherwise he'll get in the car and drive off. When they reached Chris called and was spewing hateful comments because I didn't want him to come home. You lazy fat piece of. You don't make any money. If you don't let me in when I get there, you can just pack your bags and get the F out of my house. I hung up without responding and made sure the doors were locked. Hoping Chris's brother would keep the house keys from Chris, my mom stood and watched with horror, taken aback by Chris's harsh words that echoed through the phone. I am done with this nonsense. I half cried and half yelled. When Chris sobered up, he ran off. He called that day, insinuating a new threat. I'm going to kill myself. I would later learn from him it's the consummate manipulative threat. He wouldn't tell me where he was, so I called the police. When they arrived, I explained the situation, including his threats to end his life. The officers advised me to get a protective order against Chris. So that weekend, with trepidation and a heavy heart, I went to the courthouse, and the judge issued an emergency restraining order and a child abuse protection order, considering a considering Chris a danger to the girls and me. As a typical as is typical in abusive relationships. In the next couple of days, Chris ended up apologizing and begging me to let him return home. I love you and the girls. I'll do anything. I felt sadness and had compassion for him, not for myself. I acquiesced. What I did for myself was write down everything I wanted from him to make our marriage work. I still have the list today. No more drinking with friends. Family must come first. You have to go to counseling. You have to go on a legitimate job search. Throughout our marriage, Chris had chosen his friends over me. It stung. No spouse wants to be second or third fiddle, especially to alcohol and friends who aren't pointing each other in the right direction. Often, Chris would target me as the butt of his jokes in front of friends, much like how his family picked on each other when they grew up. At times, those jokes included private information that I did not want others shared. He always followed his mean spirited wisecracks with, "I was just joking," as if they made it all okay. When Chris belittled me, the kids, and my education, I felt trapped and small, hating the words, but hating the feelings those words caused even more. I was finishing my bachelor's degree and was proud of how I was juggling the many places Chris left me to handle on my own. I was hurt that Chris blamed me for a messy house when it was all I could do to keep up with evening classes, schoolwork, the girls, or juggling finances and his alcoholism. He performed bathroom checks, inspecting the insides of toilets as if I was in the military too. If he saw dirt or grime, we were disgusting pigs, not worthy to be part of his family unit. I was much codependent spouse of an addict and a controlling husband, and while I didn't know to call it at the time, I knew deep down I deserved better. But the knowing was deep enough that I didn't quite believe it throughout the daily angst. Most of all, my heart ached when Chris acted as if I was different when he was the one who had changed. Our fun year of dating felt like years away, not just 4 years removed.
Mm,
Looking back, there were simply not enough time to get to know each other before we were married and then became parents.
mm. Oh, that's an interesting chapter. All kinds
Yeah.
of abuse. And there's so much inside there that we could discuss over a length of time. But I'll leave that for the listener to go and get the book and read and experience the before and after of those incidents. And for example, I'll just touch on one. It seems that alcoholism was one of the main culprits of the situation.
What on and off, he was,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a lot about my husband that I didn't know,
Mm,
and which is not unusual for abuse victims either.
mm,
I found a lot of things out about my late husband after he died. Um, uh, for I he was a military member when I met him. He
mm,
was active duty, and but and so I was a military spouse when we were married. And however, after he died, it wasn't until then that I had found out that how he got out of the military, he was actually not honorably discharged.
mm.
And part of that was for drug and alcohol use.
Okay.
Um, and I had also found that the DUI and alcohol issues that we had while he was married, there were other states that he had lost his license in for DUIs while
Mm,
we were married that I was not privileged to.
mm,
So yes, despite others who don't want to hear that, yeah, he did have issues with binge drinking and blacking out and um, angry outbursts and obviously drinking and driving was a huge issue for him.
Mm.
Um, and so, he was, but the hidden life that he was, which I think contributed a lot to his insecurities, was that he had a lot of things that even I didn't know about him until after he passed away, which certainly didn't help um, our marriage,
Mm.
um, because there were things that even I didn't know about him, and which didn't help me either, because then I had to question a lot about who I was married to.
Mm.
Um, I mean, half my life,
Mm.
um, not knowing somebody that I thought I knew everything about.
So, about how many years are we talking about? What was how long?
We were almost married 20 years, um, but pretty in general, we were together 20. Excuse me, 20 years.
Okay.
But we were just shy of being married. So we had dated for a year,
Mm-hmm.
and before we were married, and then we were married 19 years.
Okay. And all this time, there was that abuse, there was everything going on that was not right. And you remained there in the cage. Now, in my own words, I'll put it this way, that the cage broke in your case. But there are those who are in the cage now that need a way to find, to find their way out of the cage. What would you tell them?
Uh, to they're find somebody that they can talk to.
Mm-hmm.
Safety planning is essential for victims. It's not a matter, for those that aren't around abuse victims, again, a myth that you could just leave, pack your bags, and go.
Mm-hmm.
It can be very dangerous. The most dangerous time for a victim of abuse is from the moment they tell their abuser that they're leaving and 2 years afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so, for those that are in abusive relationships, finding somebody that they feel comfortable to confide with, and begin that process of how to get out, a shelter that may be in their area that they can talk to, and how to leave. If they have children, agencies that can assist with that process, especially if it's very volatile, and they're going to need legal assistance. If there's financial abuse involved, because they are quick moving processes that they are going to need an enormous amount of support with.
Mm-hmm.
So finding people that they can feel, because it is hard to feel who they can and cannot confide with, because you lose trust in so many people.
Mm-hmm.
So finding somebody that you can confide with, and feel comfortable with, and know that you're getting good advice with that process, because it is a very bumpy path. And I find that people who paint it with unicorns and butterflies is not a fair, uh, is not fair to people who are trying to go through the process. And I have a wonderful support system, and I've had for years, because even though my abuser has passed, it doesn't mean that I don't have others that have made mine and my daughter's life very, to be blunt, miserable, or have tried to. So my support network has been wonderful. They have been there for us 24 hours a day at times, and that is extremely important. And in return, there are those that I have, and my daughters, we pay in kind. So we phone a friend. So if it doesn't matter whether it's 2 in the afternoon or 2 in the morning, if somebody needs help, um, we know that somebody might need something.
Mm-hmm.
And that's for people. And in return, there are people, if somebody comes to you and says, I need help, I'm being abused, or this is happening, the best thing somebody can do is listen and be there for them.
Yeah, but you mentioned something there which I would like to hear your opinion about. That if someone is going through some issues of that nature, is just to pack up and go. Now, in your honest opinion, do you think that in any kind of abusive relationship there is no hope, or if there is hope to straighten things up, which way should they go? I mean, instead of living.
Well, well, I spent 20 years with that hope that if that was part of what was going on for me, is that there was this utopic idea
Mhm.
that things were always going to get better. And if we moved to this place, or if there was a job, or if we had more money, or I was a better person, I did something, I could do this, I could change this. I have pictures that span 20 years where I was changing hair colors, changing weight, changing styles, because I could be whatever he wanted me to be, and maybe that would make it better.
Mhm.
It didn't. It until I realized that I could be better for me, and I
Yeah.
didn't have to deal with him anymore. That I didn't have to do this anymore. And he needed help. I could not provide the help. It didn't matter how many degrees I collected,
Mm.
because originally I went to school for speech pathology.
Okay.
I changed my degree process because I thought I could help him.
Mm-hmm.
I could help me.
Yeah.
I was going to make us better. And once I stopped that and realized, no, that's not, I can't do that. I have to help me. I have to be better for me, for my daughters. And that's when I said I'd had enough. And I, I worked on me, and he needed to work on him. The only person that we can ever be responsible for is ourselves.
Mm.
And that was when I truly realized I didn't have to do this anymore.
Mm.
So to say that you can repair an abusive relationship, um, no, and it's not love either.
Yeah.
No, um, I think there are people out there who think that you can, um, through all the psychological counseling in the world, and we can be stronger. If he hits you, if he calls you names, or she, because there is a partners, and there's with spanning all communities, so it happens to everyone.
Yeah.
Then no, it's not. It doesn't mean that um, you can't maybe be cordial or friendly, but not as partners,
Yeah.
because I think that damage has already done.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing with us. All that is in your book, Caged. And at this point, I want to thank each and every person who's been listening to this, and those who get to listen even after we are through with the interview through the other podcast platforms that we share it on. We share it on Audible, Google Podcast, iTunes, all of them. You can always go there and search for Book Talk at Book Place and listening to this episode and other episodes before and in the future. And one mention I'll have to make through this show is Soher Rana Biswas says, glad seeing both of you. So thank you very much, Soher. And all the others who've been watching and have not commented, thank you very much. And before we go, I would like to two things. One is in your book. There's one chapter titled "Today." Does this have something to do with your life in the present day, or what is in that title? I'm curious.
Yeah. Today, as I the idea today, in some respects, today the chapter of today was done as I wrote the book,
Mm-hmm.
but um, it also is kind of an ever-changing chapter too,
Okay.
because as I keep going forward, um, it is a moving chapter
Mm-hmm.
for me. Today goes forward, and as I keep healing, my daughters keep healing, and we go forward. And I think it's a positive message for those that are trying to get out of abusive relationships.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very positive message, but for survivors, it's one more champion for those of us, because we are living and moving forward, and the three of us have done very positive pieces for our lives, and um, we are happy people. And they're, despite maybe those that would like to see otherwise, and there are always going to be those. I think that's a way of life, but
Yeah.
um, and we have, just like everybody else, which is a good thing in itself. We have good days and bad days, but that's helping us get back to where we should be, which is normal. Because for a while we didn't feel normal,
Mm-hmm.
um, and so it's a really good place for us to be now. And we're very strong, and we're strong together.
Mm-hmm.
So today's it's a chapter in the book, but it's also an evolving chapter because it doesn't change. It's ever evolving for me.
And I agree with you. We are always evolving on a day-to-day basis. We through the experiences that we got to meet on a daily basis as we continue to live, meet new people, go to different places. I mean, we can always tell the same story in a different way tomorrow than we told it yesterday.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. And I'm enjoying that. I've met some wonderful people, and people who have stories that it is there. It's a somebody said, "Oh, it's such a depressing topic." Yes, yes, it is a depressing topic. There is no way around that. It needs to be talked about. It needs to be a very on the table discussion. And but I have met some wonderful people. It's great for healing. It's great for moving forward, and it allows us to keep challenging areas that need to not be improved, but
Mhm.
just straight up need to be changed.
Oh, yes. And today we've been talking about the book Caged by Lara Sabanosh. And we are just about to go off air. But two things before we go off air. One, please tell us where we can find the book, Lala.
Uh, sure. The You can find it on Amazon is you can find it. Barnes and Noble is another. You can go straight to my website, which has all the links for that as well, which is my name, larasabanosh.com. And you can buy one directly from me, which is signed copy. And of course, it also has a way to engage with me and my social media sites, which if you'd like to send me messages, I'm always interested in feedback and hearing from people as well.
Yeah, and we will share those links on the show once it's through for you to go and buy the book or connect with Lara and get to experience life together from the cage. And last but not least, on Book Talk, before you go, we always ask the author to leave us with some words that we are always going to remember. Which are they?
Oh. Well, I encourage people to never stop speaking Because that was always my issue, which brought me to write my book. When somebody tries to silence you, please speak up and be heard.
Go. Speak up and be heard. Don't be silent. So this
Yeah.
is to you, the viewer, the listener, or whoever is out there. Don't keep silent. Speak out. And just a reminder, go and get the book, Caged by Lara Sabanosh, and read it and see what was in the cage and how to get out of the cage. And we are very glad that you've taken your time to watch. And we are very glad of you, Lara, that you've taken your time to come and share with us all about your book. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, it was our pleasure too. And bye for now.
Bye bye.
Yeah.